This is the Soul-Filled Sisterhood podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, licensed psychotherapist and soul-led leadership coach to high-achieving and highly sensitive professional women. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute, nor is it to convey professional, psychological, financial, or medical advice. If you could use such services, please seek them out from someone you trust. Now here is today's episode. 153. Have you ever wondered what your inner power may look like as an animal? Well, head over to NicoleBurgessCoaching.com/quiz and you can find out. It's just a quick 2-minute quiz that I created for you. This is a topic that comes up so often in my coaching work with women where they stand in their power and feeling empowered. And so you can head over there, NicoleBurgessCoaching.com/quiz and check this quick little thing out for you. And if you want more tips and information, you can just sign up after you take the quiz. Well, welcome, sisters. Oh, I am excited because I have a returning guest today, and it has been a few years since she has been on. My guest today is Sharon Martin. She is a licensed clinical social worker, and she is licensed in California. So she works in San Jose, California, specializing in helping individuals struggling with perfectionism, codependency, and people-pleasing. Her own struggle to feel, quote, good enough inspired her passion for helping others learn to accept and love themselves. Sharon is the author of the Better Boundaries Workbook and the CBT Workbook for Perfectionism. Her work has also been featured in various media outlets, including Psychology Today, Highly Sensitive Refuge, WebMD, and Psych Central. And I have known Sharon now for many, many years, and she is a prolific writer, and you write on so many incredible topics, Sharon. And I could not be more excited about this new workbook that you have written and talk about it today with all of my listeners. So welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right. So my first question, like I asked so many of my guests, what made you want to write this workbook after you wrote that Perfectionist workbook? Because again, that was chock full of great information for my clients as well.
Well, we can kind of look at it. Maybe there's two different pieces of it. One is the specific content that we can get into that I think there was a real need for a workbook on boundary setting, that was really lacking. I know we were chatting before we hit record, that you were telling me that, with your clinical clients, that's, been a resource that you had been looking for. And same with me. And, I think so many of us as therapists have been looking for something that we could refer our clients to support them in learning how to set boundaries. And there just wasn't a great resource that wasn't really from a Christian focused perspective, which that's fine for people who want that. But I think for a lot of us professionals, we wanted something that felt a little more neutral.
Yes.
So I really wanted to have that resource, for my own clients as well as everyone else. And that's sort of the second piece is, in writing a book, you realize that you really can help a lot more people. And I suspect it's similar in a lot of ways to having a podcast is, as clinicians, we can really only see a very small number of people in our offices for services. But a podcast, a book, anything along those lines gives us that opportunity to share a lot of that information with so many more people. And that's very gratifying. I've sort of learned a lot of things over the years of being a therapist, and I want to be able to, give that to as many people as I can and make that available and useful for people. So writing a book is a good way for me to do it. I think, as you were saying, that's a good use of my skills. I, for the most part, enjoy writing. So I like to use, that element of my skills and creativity and so forth.
Well, and you hit another important point, right? Again, part of why I did the podcast, because again, I could reach millions of people. Doesn't mean I get millions of downloads, but at the same time, it's anybody in any country. And your
books that you write, like you're saying, can be reached anywhere. So for people who don't have a therapist close by or don't know of anybody, this is like a good start that they can go with. And you and I, in our past episode, which was episode 12, when you came on, we were talking about boundaries for introverts. And I also know you're an HSP, and we've talked about that. And I've written for you, and you've written about HSPs, all that good stuff. And it's so important that for HSPs, especially whether you're in leadership or it's in your home life, and I know we're going to get into this, that we really keep practicing boundaries so that perfectionism or the people pleasing, that codependency stuff doesn't prevent us from living our best life. And that's what I think your workbook, if I can talk today, does a beautiful job of not only giving examples, but, case scenarios, and tips and all of that. So that's going to lead me into this. How did you decide which areas to cover for people in your book about boundaries? Because you did a variety.
Yeah, I tried to hit, I think, the ones that most people struggle with, and I could have honestly written a lot more. This was one of my main struggles with the publisher, is I had to keep cutting back the word count.
So it's a volume 2.
Maybe, I don't know. I had to keep cutting back. So it really, is what I think is the most fundamental pieces for people. So our home life and looking at, different kinds of relationships that we have, relationships with our children, relationships with our partner, with our extended family. And then work is obviously another big area for people in relationships with people at work. And then there's also a section about boundaries with ourselves, which sometimes people kind of forget our boundaries. But if we think about boundaries as limits, then obviously we do set limits with ourselves. And sometimes those struggles are just as big as the struggles we have with other people. Sometimes they just show up really differently, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And when you're talking about, boundaries with ourselves, we talk quite a bit about that self-care of how, if I'm working 24/7, and again, perfectionism, you can easily become a workaholic. And if I'm constantly working, or I'm only putting everyone else first and I put myself last, then there's nothing left to give, and you burn out and you get sick and all those lovely things that come with the consequences for, overgiving and overdoing. And so, yeah, that's so important to have that.
Yeah. I really think boundaries in every setting are a form of self-care. And I think maybe that's more evident for people who are more sensitive, that we tend to, I think, just feel the effects of a lack of boundaries more quickly maybe than other people, because, we don't have as much, sort of a buffer area there when there's too much coming at us, that if we aren't clear about setting a boundary or taking care of ourselves, then that starts to have those negative impacts really quickly, I think.
And I couldn't agree more. And that kind of goes into my next question. Like, how do you think this is really, this practicable can help HSPs? And you just nailed it, in the sense of being the deep feelers, deep thinkers, and getting overstimulated pretty quickly because of the nervous system. Yeah, you do. You just, at least I do. I feel it a lot sooner, and you get depleted quicker. And so I tell my clients, you've got so much bandwidth. And if you're not setting boundaries, there really isn't any more bandwidth. It's like, it's empty, it's clogged, right? And so we need those boundaries to be able to help with that.
Right. Yeah. And boundaries is the frame that I'm using for that concept. I think, other authors have talked about it using different terminology, but I think ultimately, anything that you find that's about, how can HSPs cope with the overwhelm of the world, it really comes down to the same concept, which is, right, we have to be aware of what's going on with ourselves, how we're feeling, what we're thinking, what's our body telling us. And then we need to be able to make changes. And I think those do look different for people who are more sensitive. Some of the specific boundaries that we need, but they really are all boundaries. The idea of, right, if I'm in a space where the fluorescent lights are really bothersome to me, and, I decide to leave the room, that is essentially a form of a boundary. It's not a boundary in terms of me asking somebody to stop doing something, perhaps, right? That could be a different form of the boundary, which might be, asking somebody to turn off the light or something like that. But, that's not always an option if you're at the public library or something like that, right?
Right.
But again, it's the idea of how do I take care of myself? And the boundary is, that little bubble that, the bubble wrap, right, that you put yourself in sometimes to keep some of that external stimulation from coming in at us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example of that. Like if I don't have the ability to change that, what can I do for me? And that would be, going to a different space or sitting outside or whatever I need to do to, reset because of the fluorescent lights. Yeah. Well, you've also, again, you've been a licensed clinical social work for many years, and you also do supervision with social workers. And I'm curious, if we switch from just kind of like our personal boundaries with ourselves or with others, what are some of the things you've witnessed when you have worked with your supervisees and helping them maybe set boundaries, whether it's with their business, maybe with their clients, maybe with kind of their workload? What are some of the changes you've noticed in them over the years?
Well, I think avoiding burnout is probably the biggest one. And I think this is a big problem that we have in our profession. And I mean, I don't think it's a new one, but I think it's probably been exacerbated by the last couple of years of really the pressure that mental health professionals have been under. Obviously, we've all, had a lot of difficulties related to the pandemic. But so it's always challenging when you are trying to, take care of other people, but also you need to take care of yourself. So anyway, there's been a lot of demand, of course, for mental health professionals. And, I think this is really important that if people are going to be able to have any longevity in this field, they have to learn how to set boundaries. Otherwise, they will get to a point really quickly where it's too much. It's too taxing. And I think working from home is also, a place that we need to really pay attention to those boundaries because it's so easy to just keep working, right? To see more clients because you're already at home, your office is at home, to do your notes. When you could be, doing the self-care, having some family time or doing something for your own enjoyment. So I think there's a lot of places there where the boundaries show up. Right. And that, like I was saying, that this really is a very fundamental piece that if we don't figure out how to set boundaries, then we are going to end up feeling completely depleted and overwhelmed by our work. And then it's the classic, how do you help other people?
Right.
If, you really don't have anything left to give because it's all going out, but nothing is coming in. And so, we do need to get like some sense of balance in our lives. And, it is helpful, I think, for some people to look at that from the perspective of if I want to continue to be able to do this work, or even if somebody's a mother or a caregiver in a different capacity, a nurse or a teacher.
As I say, anybody basically in the helping or serving profession.
Yes, I would say. And there's a lot of people that, fall into those categories who are really feeling the pressure, of course. And so, I think people who go into helping professions are people who have really big hearts. They want to help people. They often feel like that's their calling. And so I think it's extra painful to be in a place where you feel depleted and that, you're no longer enjoying the work in the way that you used to. It's not fulfilling. You don't feel like you're doing a good job, perhaps even. And that's where we have to remember that sometimes, sort of taking a step back, setting the boundaries is a way for us to continue to be able to do the work instead of it feeling like this is a negative thing in this moment because I have to turn away this one client or I can't help this one student. Right. It's sort of the short term versus the long term, looking at things perhaps that sometimes is helpful. Because yes, I mean, when we set boundaries, sometimes that does mean that we are saying no to somebody in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, but I think maybe the other piece of it is if it's not something that you can do, it's figuring out who else could help that person. That usually you're not literally the only person in the world who could help somebody.
Yep. And I was going to follow up. I'm like, if she doesn't say it, I'll say it. Because I know in our profession, right, the clinical side of it, we give referrals. It's like, if I'm unable to, here's some other possibilities for you to go work with this person or find some other resources type of thing. Excuse me. But it is like what you're saying. If you love what you do, it's knowing that if I'm saying no right now to this person or to this organization or to this whatever, it doesn't mean it's a forever. It just means I'm kind of at my capacity. And it's, in a way, it is protecting that because you don't want to burn out. I know recently, it's been a couple months now, I gave a presentation to a big organization and to their HR group they were all over the world. And they hear some pretty rough stuff and they get kind of talked to sometimes in a non-pleasant way. And, I was distinguishing between the burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. And this is it. So much of it is about boundary setting, and it's looking at all areas of your life, whether it's the work hours, being with your family, taking time with friends as well, making sure you're having physical exercise, you're nutritionally taking care of yourself, your spirituality. It's looking at all those areas of your life and making sure you've got harmony in those areas. And so if you're off, it's like, what needs to change or what can I do differently so that I can get back on track for what works for me so I can show up fully every single day for the people that I do serve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think boundaries are such a difficult skill for a lot of people to learn because we're not used to it. And I think part of learning how to do it is this idea of figuring out what aspect of it is actually motivating for you. What is going to help you to do something that is difficult, right? Why do it? And I think there's a lot of different reasons and ways that boundaries can be helpful for people and they can enhance their life. But I think different people will resonate, with different aspects of that. And so, I think this is one aspect of it that we're talking about. And I think if that's helpful for people, that's a great way to look at it as this is part of my self-care plan. And I think this is a lot of the messaging that HSPs get, and you can correct me, if I'm wrong. But I feel like this is something that we can accept, like that self-care is okay. And so I think that's a helpful framework for it. I think the other piece is that sometimes it feels like boundaries are mean.
Yes.
Or there's something kind of harsh about them, which I know feels really bad for me personally. And I suspect it does for a lot of other people. And so we want to also feel like we can set limits with people in a way that's not harsh, that's not mean, that it is not inherently, an act that is, sort of destructive or, hurtful to relationships. I think that's the other piece of it is sometimes it feels like the limit setting is going to create a division or a conflict in a relationship, which again, I think is painful for everybody to some extent, but for those of us that are more sensitive, it feels extra painful. And so if we're going to ask ourselves to do this thing that feels hard, right, we have to actually feel like there's a payoff in there for us. And there's a way that we can do it that feels authentic. Maybe that's a good word for it, is to feel like I can do this in a way that feels good to me, that isn't, coming across as demanding or threatening. And really, I think a lot of those kinds of things that people might call them boundaries, they're often actually not boundaries, right? Which is, sort of a pet peeve that I have, is that people use the term boundary to to describe a lot of things that happen in relationships, but they're actually not all boundaries. If it's truly a boundary, it really is based on something that you need.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, a demand of somebody to do something.
Right.
So, I mean, that's its own piece, but, there are ways, right, for us to be kind when we're making requests. And of course, I mean, that's a much, more effective way, to get things in life in general, right?
Well, correct. Yeah. And to go back to, I know for women in general, I mean, it's when you named it, like sometimes the women I work with, whether it's been in my clinical side, my coaching side, I have heard over and over, but Nicole, if I give them a limit or if I set that boundary, that's just really mean. And I'm like, where did women get this idea that setting a limit is somehow wrong or bad? And again, it's so much of our construct, right, that we get growing up. We're the caretakers. We've always got to be nice. Nice is different than being kind, right? And it means the people pleasing and all of that stuff. And if you didn't grow up in a healthy, role modeling dynamic, you may have seen a lot of that codependency and the people pleasing coming forward. And it's like, oh, this is just what you do. And so if I've set a limit, like, no, I'm not going to pick you up at the airport because I've got this going on. Again, I'm now defending myself of saying why I can't do it. So there again, I'm given too much information. And the person's like, well, why don't you just change your plans? It's like, no, I'm not willing to change my plans. You'll need to find another way to, get a ride from the airport. And that's part of it. But somehow that makes me a mean person because I've set a limit with somebody. And those are just examples, one quick little example of somehow women are supposed to like bend over backwards and do all these things. That's breaking so much of those old myths and constructs that, we're here just to take care of everybody because, you will burn yourself out. It's just exhausting to do that. And the other part you were talking about, it's how you communicate it. And you talk about assertive communication in your book as well. And I talk about it in different episodes too, that assertive communication is being direct, being compassionate, being authentic, and not doing passive where you're kind of like beating around the bush and hoping somebody understands why you're asking for what you're asking. You're really clear on what you're asking.
Yeah. I think that's really important. And that is a way that we often will undermine our own boundaries is either not being clear. And sometimes that's because we're not clear ourselves about what it is that we really need and what we're asking for. And then the other thing is being almost apologetic about asking for it, right? I mean, it's like we use this language that sort of couches the request in if it's convenient for you, or if you don't mind, or I'm sorry I have to ask you to do this, right? I mean, that just reinforces that same idea that there's something wrong with asking for something, that there's something wrong with setting a limit with somebody. And, it's like, so we're sort of undermining our own attempts at changing the dynamic in the relationship. And, I think that's part of what you're talking about when you gave the example of, picking somebody up from the airport and sort of the socialization that we get as women to be self-sacrificing, is it's often a pattern in our own relationships, but it's, a much bigger, pattern in our, society, and belief system that, of course, goes back, hundreds of years, probably to the beginning, really. And so people are, that's what they expect of us. That's what they're used to getting from us. And so we have to understand that when we start making changes with people and we start to set boundaries, that we're behaving different. And that's going to take some people a bit of adjusting.
Yeah.
If you've been that go-to person who will drop everything and pick people up or, whatever for years, and then suddenly you're like, I need to work on my boundaries and I'm going to start, setting some limits and, doing things differently. That's great. I'm 100% for that. but it's probably not realistic to expect that somebody else is going to, the first go around be like, oh, okay, great. It sounds great. I'm glad that you're doing something healthy for yourself.
Right.
Right.
Like, wait a minute. What about me now? What are you doing?
Right. And it's not necessarily because the other person doesn't care about you or doesn't care about your needs. I think sometimes it's truly just that this is the pattern in the relationship. And now you're shaking it up a little bit, and they need a little time to get on board with that.
Yep. And there will be some people in your life, and they could be family members and they could be friends that actually will not accept it. And that will be saying goodbye to those relationships or having a lot less communication or time with them, and knowing that's a grief process as well. Sometimes people are not okay with those new changes that you're making in your life. And that's part of it.
Yeah, I agree. And I usually tell folks that I think that's really the minority of people.
Yes.
For most of us, there might be one or two people who fall into that category. I hope it's not a lot for any one person. But, for if you are coming from a really dysfunctional family, it's possible that it's more. But I would say for most people, that you'll have a few of those outliers who really just for whatever reason, something that's going on with them, their own history, that they really can't tolerate anybody setting limits with them. That's kind of a category of, folks onto themselves that we need to approach boundaries different with them. But most people, in my experience, will come around if we, have some patience with them. And if it's somebody that you are actually close to, I think it can be helpful to just give them a heads up that this is something that you're working on, that this is a change that you're trying to make. It doesn't mean you need to justify it. Right. You might explain it, if it's somebody like your spouse or, again, somebody, your best friend, somebody that you're in a really close relationship with, just so that they can understand what the context is for this change. But then we need to keep practicing our own skills, but we also need to give them opportunity just to practice accepting the limits that we're setting with them too. Because it is hard to be on the other side of boundaries too. I think if we're honest, a lot of us have a hard time when somebody says no. If we really want something or feel like it's really important to us and somebody says no, it can be rough. I mean, that's true of adults as well as kids.
Yeah. Yeah, you may feel disappointed because, again, you've had an expectation of their behavior, expectation of this event, and it's just like, okay, that's my stuff. I get to feel disappointed. I get to feel whatever. But like you're saying, all of this is so much practice. And I know, again, this to me, this book goes so well with your perfectionism book too, and what I've talked about on the podcast as well, that you're not expected to, as you're shifting up some of these boundaries, whether it's at work, with how you're parenting and your relationships, whatever it may be, that you may flub up. Oh my goodness, the world's not going to end and it's okay and all that good stuff. You just keep practicing and you'll get better and better at it. And that guilt you may feel those first few times, that starts to go away because, again, you're not hurting somebody intentionally. You're not causing harm to people. They may not like it, or they may be like, oh, well, okay, that's different. I'm disappointed, but everybody's still alive. Everybody's still okay. It's adjusting. That's all it is. It's different.
Yeah. And I think it's also, you might look at it as giving people the opportunity to solve their own problems or come up with other kinds of solutions to things, rather than it always being you are the solution, right? You're the one who's meeting everyone's needs. That given the opportunity, again, I think people can come up with some different ways of doing that sometimes maybe it's even better. It gives them, again, they may not like it in the moment. They probably won't because it's a challenge, but it does open up more possibilities, I think. People.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Sharon, I'm curious. I know, we were talking about kind of our own boundaries of like how long the podcast episode's even going to be. So before I say, hey, tell people how to find you, your book and all that good stuff, I am curious, as you were on this book tour, and this is going to come out, probably release this episode in December here. And so this book went live, at the end of October, beginning October?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So how are you doing with setting boundaries and taking care of you as you're doing your book launch as well? Because I know for so many authors, right, it's trying to get it out there, the message out there for people. So how are you doing with your self-care?
Wow, Nicole, way to go to the heart of the matter, right? No, I'm just kidding. It's fine. You know what? It's challenging. Mm-hmm. I think that's the answer is, like you were saying, I don't get it perfectly either. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of stuff on my plate. Even though I knew there was a lot of advance warning about when this book mm-hmm. was going to be published. So it certainly wasn't a surprise. But there tends to be a lot of last minute details, a lot of little extra things. But again, it's all good. This is not, negative, stuff for me. It's all wonderful, but it does get stressful for sure. Mm-hmm. And I know when I'm in the process of writing the book, I'm very mindful of the fact that means I need to cut back, the number of clients that I'm seeing and, change my schedule a bit so that I have time to do the writing. Otherwise, mm-hmm. I can't do everything that I was doing before, plus write a book at the same time.
Yeah.
There might be some people who could do that, but I know that I personally cannot. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely something that I am very intentional about, trying to set the limits there so that I just have time for things. Mm-hmm. But I think at this point, it's sort of a constant balancing of things where yes. I, have lots of lists and I have my calendar, mm-hmm. right? And I'm, going, okay, where is this going to fit and where is this going to fit? Yep. But again, I think sort of that bigger picture is because I knew ahead of time that sort of this, roughly this chunk of time I was going to need to do promotion related things for the book. Mm-hmm. That means I have, not written a new blog post in a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. That means that I'm doing some work on the weekends. It means, I can't think of another example, but things like that where I've made some shifts. But I also know that that's not going to last forever.
There it is. Yep.
Right.
Time
so
limited. Yes.
So I can do that for a period of time. And the goal, of course, is to then get back to, not working so many hours and, being able to kind of come back to what is a better schedule for myself. So again, I think, when there's an intention and there's a need for something that we can make, we can kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say that it's a completely, that I don't have boundaries. It's just, putting them in different places for a period of time.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I don't mean to say this is a comparable example, but it also reminds me of, if you have a crisis in your life, if somebody mm-hmm. perhaps dies unexpectedly, that's going to be a period of time, where, again, you would need to shift some of those boundaries that you mm-hmm. would need to, you just have to make time in your schedule to do other things and for other people. But again, it's different because that's not going to last forever.
Right.
That's what kind of reminded me when you were saying that. So there are going to be times like that. I think that everybody faces for different reasons. But I think the important thing is to remember where your boundaries need to be for your optimal health and well-being and for your relationships, so that when you get off track, you can sort of come back to that place that feels right for you.
Yeah.
Because I think, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you're also really naming, like, sometimes boundaries change and boundaries sometimes actually can be fluid. Like, you've got kind of like when you're not writing a book, your life kind of looks this way. When you are writing a book, which I think so many of my authors, they don't really say, like, they don't cut back on time. So I know some of my guests I know are not HSPs, right? Which is so fascinating because I'm like, my HSP authors, they have to shift some things, right? Because you can't do everything. But it is looking at that. It's like, okay, and then when it comes to promotion time, again, that's going to look different then when I'm not writing a book, when I'm not in that process, everything begins to shift and it's time temporary. It's not a forever.
Yeah. No, that's a great example. And I love that you mentioned that element of flexibility, because that is an element of healthy boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of flexibility in sort of a chunk of time, but we can also think about flexibility in terms of an individual boundary that shifts either with different people in your life or in different situations with the same person. Because you're right, we don't want to set boundaries that are so rigid that then they don't actually work for us. Right? I think that's
perfectionism.
Sort of that's one tendency that people have. I think, especially people that have been hurt or traumatized will often sort of go to the extreme of setting these really rigid boundaries, but it can also be isolating. And, and actually not that great, in relationships, because you're not really letting anybody in,
right.
And you're not giving yourself any space for things to shift in ways that actually might work well for you. So thank you for, mentioning that part of it, because you're right. That is an important piece of a boundary as well.
Yeah. Well, I love that when I put you on the spot like that, you were able to say, and here's my process of what I do. So I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that with my listeners too, since I put you on the spot. Well, I'm curious, Sharon, share with my listeners, what's your website where they can find you? And I have no doubt you also have a link for where they can buy the book, but what are some of the places they can buy the book?
Oh, sure. The book should be available at all major bookstores or stores that sell books. So it's funny, not you don't buy books just at bookstores anymore. Get a place at Target and things like that. But Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all those, and really almost any bookstore can get any book for you these days. But certainly all the big ones. And then my website is livewellwithsharonmartin.com, and that's where I've got most of my writing and all kinds of other, related things.
Yeah. And so, ladies, again, I will have all of Sharon's information, a link to the book, all that good stuff. It'll be on the show notes. Sharon's website is chock full of good stuff. She's got, whether it's blog posts or Pinterest items or things you want to download, she's got it. So definitely head over there and check it out. And I just want to say thank you again, Sharon, for being on and for writing another workbook that I know is going to be a huge hit with the people I work with. And I'm sure those that are in just various parts of the world being able to have access to you because they're not in the state of California. So I'm glad that you wrote this.
Oh, well, thank you. And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk a bit about it.
Thank you for listening. And if you're interested to find out what your inner power is as an animal, head over to NicoleBurgessCoaching.com/quiz. Till next time.